Hello everyone, and welcome to this PwC hosted webinar where we will be unpacking the first nature-related sustainability disclosures from Denmark. We have prepared a really interesting program for you, we think. And with me today, I am Susanne Stormer. I'm a partner and sustainability services leader at PwC. Many of you will have seen me before in these webinars. I am joined today by Annette Schødt-Fie, my colleague, who heads up our biodiversity and nature work, and Isabel Scheckenbach, who is our expert and who will be sharing the insights from our assessment. And then I'm very pleased to also introduce our guest today, Kath Taylor from Novo Nordisk, who will be talking about your work with nature and nature positive strategy. So welcome everyone, and let's get started. We have a lot to share. So today, first of all, I will be very briefly setting the scene on why nature and biodiversity matter to your business. And then Annette will talk about how the CSRD, the Directive on Reporting, integrates global frameworks for biodiversity and ecosystems. And then we will have Isabel sharing the insights that we have gleaned from the first season of Danish CSRD compliant reports. And then over to Kath to share the business case from Novo Nordisk about how you're driving change through a nature positive business. As always, we will make sure we have time for questions and answers from you. So please send them to us. We will respond to them during the webinar as best we can. And otherwise, we will follow up with you individually. And to those of you who will be asking, will we get the slides? Yes, you will. The webinar will be available. The recording will be available on our website as always. So let's get started. Nature, as I just want to remind you, is the term that refers to all the collective ecosystems, to biodiversity, and to natural resources that make up our planet's environment. So in a business perspective, we're talking about land, water, resource use, waste, pollution, and all of that is also intrinsically linked to the delivery of climate and societal goals. So nature is not a standalone issue. We also know that nature does provide us as a society and as businesses with services that we couldn't do without natural capital, but we also see that this natural capital is being lost. And I won't dwell on the statistics because many of you will know them already, but you can refer back to them if you need for your own purposes. It is a fact that about half of the global GDP is dependent on nature and ecosystem services, which means it is important for business. And what we share here is a list of the sectors that are in one way or the other, directly or through their supply chain, dependent on nature. So have a look at this list, and most likely you will find your own business on that list, or you will have partners in your own ecosystem that will be dependent on nature. So this is important. It's also important from a risk perspective, because if we look at the 10-year risk horizon that we see from the WEF Global Risk Report, we see that biodiversity and ecosystems that are essential to continue to have healthy businesses, that these topics are moving up the ranks, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse being the second most important identified risk over the long term, as well as critical changes to Earth systems, again illustrating how it correlates with climate change, and finally natural resource shortages. So if you were in any way in doubt whether this is relevant for your business, we just want to establish that is definitely now the case. So with that, over to you, Annette.
Thank you, Susanne. And I would like to give a little bit of insight how the CSRD via ESRS E4 brings together a web of international and EU framework to ensure a robust and meaningful disclosure on nature. I will, over the next slides, cover those we find as the most important framework for CSRD when it comes to nature. And I would like to start with the planetary boundary framework, which provides a scientific foundation for understanding the limits of the Earth, the planet, ecosystems when it comes to, for example, biodiversity, land use, and fresh water. The role to CSRD is not mandatory, but it influences the risk disclosure and the systemic impact awareness in the CSRD and in the EU policies. So kind of a framing lens it puts on. The second one we have in the middle, the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, sets a global biodiversity ambition. For example, halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. It contains 23 concrete targets, including ecosystem restoration, pollution reduction, and responsible business conduct. In the role and the link to CSRD, it's designed to align corporate reporting on those targets, especially around nature, of course. And the final one is the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. It's the EU's own biodiversity roadmap and foundation policy underlying both CSRD and the sectoral regulation. It includes commitments, for example, to the nature restoration law. Over the past few years, we have seen a major shift in how nature and biodiversity are being integrated into EU legislation. This slide highlights 3 critical EU regulations that together form the backbone of this shift. EU Nature Restoration Law is a groundbreaking policy shift from protection to restoration. It's legally binding member states to restore degraded ecosystem, including agricultural land, wetlands, river, forest, and even urban green spaces. The link to CSRD is if you are a company managing land or has land use impact, this law creates direct reporting obligations. The EU Deforestation Regulation, which goes beyond disclosure, to demand action and traceability. If your company trades in products like soya, coffee, palm oil, woods or beef, you must prove your supply chain are deforestation-free. The link here to the CSRD is that you have affected value chains, you need to do the due diligence. And finally, the CSRD, the E4, brings together nature into a corporate reporting framework, requiring companies to assess, disclose their impact and dependencies on nature across the value chain. Together, these laws form a coherent regulation signals. Nature is no longer just an externality, it's a reportable, trackable, and in many cases, regulated obligation. And it affects how business operate from supply chain to use of land and to investor disclosures. Which moves us into the next slide. The Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure offers a structured framework on how companies can manage disclosed nature-related risk and opportunities. At the heart of the TNFD framework are 4 key disclosure pillars adapted from the TCFD, but tailored to the nature dependencies, impact, risks, and opportunity. The TNFD framework provides 2 main tools. First, the LEAP approach, locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare, a process for identifying material nature-related issues, which I will get back to on the next slide. And then the 4 pillars of disclosure, governance, strategy, risk, impact, management, and targets, as we have on this slide here. The governance under that pillar, companies should disclose how nature-related issues are integrated into the governance structure, meaning is the board, do they have the oversight on nature-related risks and opportunities, the role of management in assessing and manage nature-related matters, and how nature is embedded into policies, committees, and responsibilities, all linking back to and aligning with the CSRD cross-cutting ESRS G1. Moving into the strategy, the second pillar, focus on how nature-related issue affects the organization's strategy, business model, and financial planning over short time, mid-term, and long time. Material natural-related impacts and dependencies, how these influence the strategy decision, and any scenarios and targets or nature-related transitions plan. The third pillar includes the risk and the impact assessment. And here, like you do with the enterprise risk management, you need to inform about the methodology used for the material assessment, like have you used the TNFD and the LEAP approach, the process for integrating nature into the enterprise risk management system. And all this is to make sure and showing if you take this as serious as you would do any other financial risks. And finally, we have the target setting and also reporting on that. To wrap up these 4 pillars, create a structured process and decision-making useful for companies to understand and disclose on how nature impacts them and how they impact it. And as I said, at the heart of the TFND, then we have the LEAP approach. It provides a structured step-by-step process that helps companies identify, assess, manage, and report on the nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. First, and as the start, is of course to locate the interface with nature, the physical assets like factory, farms, mines, sourcing areas, and raw materials, and it's both upstream and downstreams. For biodiversity, this means mapping activities against sensitive ecosystems like forest, wetlands, coral reef, or protected areas. Moving to the next one is to evaluate dependencies and impact. Once the location are known, the company needs to evaluate how they depend on nature and how they impact it. This step is key to understand where the business is vulnerable and where it causes biodiversity losses. It's closely linked to the double materiality as part of the CSRD. The next step is the assessment of risk and opportunity. These steps involve the analysis of financial relevance of those dependencies and impacts. This could be the physical risks, it could be the transitions risks, regulation risks like the EUDR we just talked about, or the opportunities. Companies should assess how they change in ecosystems, health might disrupt the business model or present a new expectation from regulators or investors. And finally, it's to prepare and respond and report. This final step is to develop mitigation, adaptations, strategies to set targets, and of course also to engage with stakeholders and prepare for the reporting. So to sum up, the LEAP approach is not just a reporting tool, it's a strategy process. It's enable companies to understand their true exposure to biodiversity loss, improve resilience, and demonstrate accountability in line with the CSRD. So we have also provided a slide summing up these links, but I think for now this should do, and then it's over to actually see how the companies have worked with this in the reports. Please, Isabel.
I would like to start by diving into the structure of the ESRS E4 standard on biodiversity and ecosystems. The standard centers around 4 main pillars, namely governance, strategy, IRO management, and then metrics and targets. And thus, the architecture is similar to the TNFD voluntary reporting framework. The E4 standard has the objective to provide you as a company with practical guidelines to effectively disclose your impact of your business activities on biodiversity and ecosystems. And these impacts can be categorized into 4 main categories, namely the direct impact drivers of biodiversity loss, impacts on the state of species, impacts on the extent and condition of ecosystems, and impacts on ecosystem services, as well as the resulting dependencies from those. The standard highlights the necessity for companies to conduct a resilience analysis in order to identify and assess and then effectively manage physical and transitional risks that arise from biodiversity loss and ecosystem deterioration in an effective way, but also for you to identify potential opportunities and harness those ones. With respect to the management of your identified material impacts, risk, and opportunities, the standard encourages companies to align your policies, actions, and targets with the international frameworks that Annette just mentioned to, first of all, encompass the complexity of biodiversity issues in a comprehensive way, but secondly, especially to leverage the existing methodologies, data sources, and resources and base your actions on science-based insights. In the next minutes, we'll dive a little bit deeper into the different disclosure requirements, giving you some examples based from the recently published CSRD reports of Danish companies and providing you with practical recommendations in order to further enhance and enrich your future nature reporting. Please be aware that those are only like an excerpt of examples and thus, of course, not exhaustive. Yep. Over the last weeks, we analyzed 40 different CSRD reports from Danish companies with respect to their disclosure on biodiversity and ecosystem-related impacts, risks, and opportunities. And we were actually really delighted to see that nature has made it on the agenda of Danish businesses. I think that's really hopeful. 40% of the companies under review have identified material impacts, risks, and opportunities, reflecting the importance of biodiversity and ecosystems to their business models. Notably, those companies that act in sectors that have high impacts, as mentioned by Susanne before, or have high dependencies, have of course identified E4 as being a material topic for them. And these companies are usually acting in the agricultural, food and beverage sector, but also of course in pharma and biotechnology, as well as energy and utility sector. If we look at the different perspectives of the double materiality assessment, then it's noteworthy to see that the majority of Danish companies actually emphasizes the impact perspective over the financial perspective. So we assume that, or we have experienced that Danish companies are well aware of their corporate responsibility with respect to nature and the state of nature. On the other hand, we were a little bit surprised to see that only a few companies have actually identified risks that are arising from biodiversity loss and ecosystem deterioration. So we think there's still like a gap of like unidentified risk in a lot of business models, which could pose a challenge to the resilience of some of the business models. And we would definitely advise you to have an additional look into your analysis of nature-related risk and opportunities. Although many companies are still at the beginning of the nature journey, a significant number of companies have already done some kind of value chain assessment and engagement with their suppliers, which is demonstrated by the fact that if we look at the distribution of material IROs across the value chain, 45% of the companies that have identified as E4 as being material have identified those impacts in their own operations, but also in the value chain. And an additional 50% of the companies have identified material impacts in their value chain. And this can be interpreted as actually a positive sign with respect to the future, because we expect that companies that have done that exercise will also in the future engage with their suppliers and value chain stakeholders in order to join efforts and tackle the identified impacts, risks, and opportunities together. Now we want to dive a little bit deeper into the different disclosure requirements. In terms of biodiversity policies, it's encouraging to see that 75% of the companies reviewed have established some form of biodiversity-related policies. However, the majority of those policies is still part of like an umbrella of an environmental policy or maybe like an environmental management system. And only a few companies have dedicated standalone policies for biodiversity. One example is Pension Denmark, which we've highlighted here. They have set biodiversity goals and initiatives that are embedded in especially their real estate investment business activities. And their policy mandates that an investment screening tool is to be used in order to ensure that in land use decisions, biodiversity is considered. In addition, their biodiversity policy highlights the avoidance of project developments in areas with a high biodiversity value and the prioritization of preservation activities. If you're currently in the process of designing specific biodiversity policies, then we recommend you that you actually develop comprehensive biodiversity policies that clearly define the scope, the commitment, and how those policies actually contribute to your targets across your own operations, but also in the value chain. When you're designing the policies, focus on critical areas, such as, for example, deforestation-free supply chains or the impact of land use change. Those focus areas are also mentioned in the ESRS E4 standard and then match again to the European policies and international frameworks that Annette has introduced before. In addition, Business for Nature has published an overview of sector-specific actions, which can be a very good starting point for you in your ideation process and definitely provide some really good and science-based ideas for the most effective policies and actions that you could implement within your business. To ensure the alignment of your biodiversity strategy and policies, and to anchor it in your current operations, we recommend to establish clear responsibilities for implementing those biodiversity policies and assigning accountability at the executive level in order to guarantee that biodiversity remains a strategic priority for your company. Our review of biodiversity targets highlighted that most of the companies are still in the early stages of their target setting process, while a few leaders indicate some level of alignment with international frameworks like the SBTN or Planetary Boundary Framework. The majority of companies has only disclosed their ambition level in a qualitative way. One example we wanted to highlight today is Royal Unibrew, a beverage company that has aligned its target already with international frameworks like the European Biodiversity Strategy, but also Denmark's Green Tripartite Agreement. Royal Unibrew has set time-bound and outcome-oriented targets that are aligned with the mitigation hierarchy outlined by the SBTN. And one of their targets, for example, revolves around zero deforestation by 2025, which is also approved by the SBTI flag targets. If you're beginning your target setting processes, there are actually a lot of resources that you could build on and then that you can actually leverage. When setting targets, always ensure that those targets are time-bound, measurable, and outcome-oriented. PwC's Nature Strategy Handbook provides a really good starting point for setting up a strategy process to identify targets and guides you through the different phases. And in addition, SBTN has set up a lot of guidances on targets for the different impact categories and published a lot of sector guidances. And just recently started setting up a target validation process to make sure that your targets are actually scientifically based and aligned with the international frameworks. Ensure that your targets are underpinned by scientific data and risk assessment in order to establish robust processes and control, and then transparently monitor your progress and to be able to reliably report on your targets. And lastly, we would encourage you to engage with suppliers, with industry experts, NGOs, and policymakers to leverage collaborative action and enhance your ability to achieve your targets effectively. Finally, we looked into the disclosures on biodiversity metrics, primarily from Danish companies, and we found that only a few companies, 30% actually, have implemented specific metrics in their reporting. So this can be seen as an indication that a lot of companies are, first of all, still beginning their nature reporting journey, but secondly, might also be struggling with specific challenges in identifying and calculating their impact metrics. ESRS, for example, has applied the integrated biodiversity assessment tool in order to identify their sites that are located close to protected or key biodiversity areas and has published those in a tabular format in their CSRD report, and also applied different buffer zones that account for the different impacts they have at their material sites. Moving forward, it's essential for you to concentrate on metrics that are directly linked to your biggest impact. So definitely take a risk-based approach here, focus on your biggest impacts, the biggest or the most important commodities that you have and the most relevant locations within your value chain. Leverage reliable data sources that are publicly available, like the IBET tool or Encore tool. And in addition, TNFD has published core disclosure metrics that you could use as a starting point, as well as sector guidance metrics, which provide you already with like really good information, as well as like tools that you could use in order to set up like methods for measurement of your metrics and to enable you to transparently progress and monitor your achievements. And I think after those insights, we're really excited to hear Kathy's perspective on how Novo Nordisk is moving forward on its nature positive journey.
Indeed we are, but before we do that, we have a couple of questions from the audience that I would like to ask you, because thank you both for this expose, and it sounds super easy. You just use the frameworks, the data, the resources available, then you have a wonderful report. And of course, we know that there's a lot more hard work and devil in the detail going into it. So what we can do in our role is to inspire our clients and others. That's, for instance, what we did when we hosted the Nature Conference. At that time, we didn't have any reports, so now we are much wiser. We can also challenge and advise, but at the end of the day, it's up to you to make those decisions about how you do it. So, Annette, a question to you, or rather two questions. I will fold them into one. So the first question is, which materiality criteria apply when you look at this? And then secondly, and this is a hard one, so hopefully we can make it short, how are IROs, I mean, impacts, risks, and opportunities, consolidated throughout the value chain? So this is clearly coming from somebody who knows their deal.
Yes, very good questions. So when something material goes with the same discussion I'm sure you have had when you did your DMA assessment. So when do you think it's so material so you include it in those IOs that you need to report on? And that is, of course, very difficult to set that threshold in the beginning. But I think some of the tools that from the frameworks, the LEAP, that I just briefly spoke about, some of the things Isabel touched upon are tools that can be used to get an understanding how much are you impacting, how much are you dependent on these, for example, raw materials. And then the second question
is about how do you consolidate the impacts, risks, and opportunities?
Yeah, the whole consolidation is a little bit of an animal in itself, but dependent on when you look at your value chain and how many different subsidiaries you have or how many different value chains you have, then it's a matter of actually, again, getting back to what are the areas where you do the most impact on the planet when it comes to nature, or where are you most vulnerable when it comes to some of these material or fresh waters that you are utilizing. So we are back again to where does it matter most for you, or where do you impact most?
So it's about making a well-informed judgment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. On that note, let's turn to you, Kath. And for those who have been paying attention to what was said about getting the leadership support, the board support, the data right, etc. Well, you can share with us how you went about it, because you are, as always, a first mover in this space.
Yeah, it wasn't an easy process, but hopefully I can give some insight into the things that we did last year and how we've approached the topic. So we took really a whole year last year to develop our first nature roadmap. And that really started with that assessment piece. So looking at our dependencies, our impacts, our risks, our opportunities across our whole value chain. And then we had a whole process engaging the entire organization to make sure that we were identifying the right actions and that we were getting the right support from leadership throughout the organization. And then we had the right governance in place at the end. But if we go back to the beginning in terms of how we identified, what did we identify? So like most companies, we have a fundamental dependence on nature. As Novo Nordisk, we're a pharmaceutical company. Without nature, we wouldn't be able to serve our patients. And that's because we have a dependency on nature right across our value chain. So as part of our assessment, we aligned that with the SBTN frameworks, but also with the TNFD LEAP approach. So really trying to understand where in our value chain we had the dependencies, where we had the impacts, and when that then generated risk from the business from either an operational perspective or from a transition risk, reputational, access to finance perspective. What we found is, again, like most companies, the majority of our impact sits in that upstream value chain. So it's really linked to that dependence on natural resources. So for us, that's things like forests that provide the paper and packaging we need to ensure safe delivery of our medicines to our patients. It's the wheat and maize that is used to make glucose, which fuels our medicine production systems. And all of those things upstream also require water as inputs. So we were not only using all of these raw materials, but through the use, this of course contributes to the degradation of nature. So we know that intensive agriculture kind of degrades soils. We know that paper supplies can contribute to deforestation. We also of course, have an impact and dependency on nature within our direct operations. It's around 5% of our total impact, but of course, it's a really critical one for us to address because it's something that's directly within our control. And really, our key dependency here is on water. We require fresh water to make our medicines for our patients. So a really fundamental dependency on nature. And some of our operations are placed in areas of water scarcity, which kind of helps escalate that risk. We also have some really key specific dependencies on biodiversity, especially. So we, within the pharmaceutical industry, rely on horseshoe crab blood as part of our safety testing procedures. And we also, at Novo Nordisk in particular, rely on yeast, which is a little single-cell organism, which is actually the factory which helps produce our medicines. And although the yeast that we use now isn't taken from nature, it was originally, yeast would have originally come from nature. So across those three topics, we really focused on land, water, and biodiversity. There was also the biodiversity at sites component. So particularly as a company that's expanding rapidly, we have impact on natural habitats when we are building new sites. So those were the impacts and dependencies that we identified throughout our assessment. So then the challenge was, what do we do about it? So we developed the nature roadmap. So that was looking at these key material topics, identifying the kinds of actions that we could take, and then using those to help set our kind of overarching ambition levels. And for us, it was really important that we aligned with the Global Biodiversity Framework ambition. And so for that, we have these two overarching ambitions. And the first is to halt the loss of nature by 2033. So that's really to ensure that we're doing everything we can to avoid further degrading nature within our value chain. So that's things like making sure we're not contributing to deforestation, or we're doing everything we can to optimize our water use at sites. But really, we know with nature that halting the loss is not enough, because nature has been degraded to such an extent that the planetary boundaries have been breached. We're no longer in a safe operating space. So that's why it's so important to have this nature positive trajectory. We have to go above and beyond and help actively restore the nature that's been lost. So that will be active restoration projects, but also the reality is we need to think about new business models, new ways to make our products, because otherwise we will continue to degrade nature as we grow as a business. And so all of that came together with 5 work streams. So we have land, water, biodiversity, which are our halt the loss of nature tracks, and restore and transform, which are our nature positive tracks. And within these tracks, we then have specific ambitions and actions. So on land, we're focusing on 2 of our most material raw materials. So that's paper and cardboard. So making sure that those are deforestation free. And all of our glucose, which comes from wheat and maize, will be sourced from regenerative farming systems, which help to restore the soil. On water, we're going to be doing our absolute best to improve our water use at our production sites. But what we need to do first is really to map out what those saving opportunities are, and then use that to create some more concrete targets in a couple of years' time. The biodiversity track is focusing on the biodiversity impact we're having at our production sites. And we want to make a commitment to having a net positive impact, particularly at our expansion projects. And within this track, we also have a commitment to avoid impact on endangered species. So that's that horseshoe crab, and doing everything we can to phase out any use of endangered species within the business. Under restoration, we'll be focusing on within value restoration to start with. So making sure that we're developing restoration projects near those priority sites. So helping to ensure that we're improving the water quality and quantity and the water catchments in which our production sites are placed. But we also want to develop a broader beyond value chain restoration plan, which is really going to help drive that nature positive ambition. And then finally, one of our most exciting tracks is our transform track. So this is really about how can we fundamentally rethink how we make our products. So glucose is one of our most important drivers of nature impact. So can we re-envision our production systems so that we don't need glucose at all? We have 2 approaches to that. We're looking internally at how we can optimize our existing systems, and we're also looking externally at collaborations on can we use 2nd generation, 3rd generation waste materials, or completely different materials with lower nature impact to help fuel those production systems.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And this begs a lot of questions. So if I may, and perhaps stick with this one, because what you're indicating here also, when you talk about regenerative agriculture, you would rely on other parties in your value chain to help deliver on that. Is that feasible to have sufficient regenerative agriculture to feed your production needs?
Absolutely. And this was really part of the whole process in terms of identifying the actions. We were then assessing the feasibility of what would the supply be like? Can our current suppliers provide this to us, or would we need to kind of shift supply? And we are, I think, fortunate in pharmaceutical industry in that we actually have a relatively small nature footprint. So our demand for regenerative cereal crops would be just a small fraction of what someone like Carlsberg would need. So actually it's been relatively straightforward for us to have those conversations with suppliers and start to secure that regenerative supply.
And speaking of the pharmaceutical sector, so one of the things that we had been looking forward to would be sector-specific standards on reporting. It seems that that is a way into the future. So have you been working with your peers in the pharmaceutical sector as an early mover? How would that pan out?
So actually later this week, we're going to have published the Nature Positive roadmap for the pharmaceutical sector, which PwC supported on, but led by WBCSD. And this identifies what are the key actions. Well, it goes right back to what are the common impacts, dependencies that we have as a sector, and then what are those priority actions that we should all be taking. So that really helps to kind of align us in terms of what should be expected from pharma.
And speaking of leadership and management and board support for this, can you share what has been the biggest challenge as you worked on preparing this?
I mean, it's a completely new topic for the business. It's not an easy topic to grasp. I think people often, when you talk about nature, they'll think about lions and tigers and bears, where really what we're talking about is soil and water and very fundamental dependencies. So there's that kind of initial understanding gap that we need to get across. And then, of course, it's always a challenge within a business with competing priorities, competing sustainability priorities. What we've done is to try and integrate as much as possible with our climate work, with our plastic work, to make sure that we're not coming to the same stakeholders the same with lots of different topics.
And I think that's a great tip to share with others joining the webinar here, that likely you would have worked with climate action, with other challenges, so build on that and take the same process, I guess is what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. We developed a climate roadmap at the same time, and regenerative glucose, for example, is a key lever which sits across both roadmaps.
Right. So thank you so much. And let's have an open discussion now. And I would actually want to turn to you, Isabel, because we have a question about the nature positive and the calculation. So how can you calculate a nature positive, and how do you go about working with this nature positive mindset?
Yeah. So first of all, of course, you have to start with an analysis of your current impacts on nature and biodiversity and ecosystem, and use those ones as a starting point in order to have like a solid foundation to know what is your current contribution to nature deterioration. And then based on that, you can look into different measures and identify those measures that are most effective for your business model, and then have like a quantitative assessment of those measures with respect to how could they reduce the impacts that you have identified at the stage before that. And then there will be like still probably a small gap, and then you could look into which additional strategies and actions could you actually pursue in order to make sure that those would add to a rather nature positive business. But maybe, Kat, you can also give some insights how you went about that since you developed the whole nature positive roadmap, and what your approach was to it.
Yeah, we really tried to take a data-driven approach. So using the data that we could access and from our supply chain, and really using those frameworks. So in particular, the science-based targets for nature, the first 2 steps, which I think provides quite a clear methodology in terms of how to assess the nature impacts and identify priorities. But it's not simple. There's lots of gaps in the data. And the job isn't finished once you've done the analysis. Really, there's a lot of work to then sense check that with the organization and get on board your stakeholders.
Yeah. And maybe that's a question for you, Annette. So how do you deal with the fact that that data is imperfect and likely not even available?
Yeah, like for when you do other risks assessments, then it's a matter of making some key assumptions that you can work from, because it's not so much, I know it would be better if we had perfect data, but that's rarely the case. But it's actually a matter of then make some clear assumptions, not too complicated, so everybody understands where is the starting point that you have taken. And then over time, then those gaps, if we like to call them that, those will be improved and be less of, and then the quality will increase. But I think if you both internally understand where you have taken some key assumptions, and it might also be relevant to discuss with your peers in the industry, because then you can start comparing. So if you take some of the same things, but I recognize that some of the gaps that you would be faced with is based on how you collect information on procurement and things like that as well.
And maybe to add to that, the CSRD reports that have been published now within Europe, they provide us with like an increased level of data actually that you could leverage on.
And that's a good, also a good insight. So what you said was that it was quite encouraging to see the reports that have come out. So now we have shared examples from Denmark only, but of course many European other reporters. And I know that you've been looking in particular to those coming out of Germany.
Yeah. So I would say if you go back like maybe a year ago, then the Danish companies were, of course, kind of spearheading the nature journey because it's part of their business culture, I would say, and they really are aware of their corporate social or corporate responsibility. Now you can see that other markets, due to the CSRD, are more aware of nature-related risk and impacts and are kind of trying to catch up with the Danish companies.
So again, trailing the same development we've seen in climate, where it started with responsibility and then moving into this is actually a risk for us because we have dependencies. So, Kat, a couple of questions from the audience to you. First of all, a technical one. So what methodology do you use to calculate where your impacts are in the value chain? So the reference is that in your slide, you stated that 95% is in the value chain and only 5% in your own operation. So how did you go about it?
Yeah, so that was based on the SBTN methodology. I would caveat that these are estimates. They're not precise. It's a work in progress. We will, I'm sure, revise this number. And this in particular is based primarily on LCA data. So actually the 95% doesn't explicitly include the state of nature component, which is important to the SBTN process. But it is really challenging, I think, and everyone will agree, with value chains to get the precise location data in order to make that state of nature component meaningful. So, 95% is from LCAs.
Good. And then another question to you is, how do you ensure integration? So you mentioned the roadmaps for nature and climate. So you would have two parallel roadmaps. How do you integrate them, and how do you avoid having a partial view?
So they were developed at the same time. We sit within the same team within the business, and we really kind of looked at were there different categories or topics that nature should lead on versus climate. So For example, paper and packaging is not a huge contributor to our carbon footprint, but is one of our major drivers of our nature footprint. So in that case, we sort of took the lead in terms of identifying actions, but really we did a lot of joint stakeholder engagement to make sure that we were aligned.
And another question is, so how far are you in measuring performance and report metrics externally? And then a follow-up question is, which challenges do you face in reporting on metrics? I guess you have addressed it, but perhaps just elaborate.
I think that we have a strategy and ambition levels. I think we're still working on metrics and the right way to measure this. What we do have is, I guess, activity-based metrics. So we can look at how much of our supply comes from regenerative glucose, or how many suppliers that we're working with. But we don't yet have this will contribute to a percentage improvement in nature. That's a work in progress. And I think I'm not sure that anybody quite has the right or perfect solution to this just yet. But it's something that we'll be looking at over the next year. And
likely, as a science-driven organization, you are used to being very particular about the quality of data.
Yeah, absolutely. And we would very much like to have a simple way of tracking progress and targets on nature. And a little bit, it's getting the organization to understand that maybe isn't this straightforward in this instance. We can't necessarily have a single number.
So we also have a question about what approach to upstream value chain would you recommend for impacts which are not sitting with immediate suppliers, but several tiers below? And I guess that also addresses one of the questions that we will be talking about, namely how deep do you need to go in your value chain? So maybe first you, and then turn to our experts afterwards.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it depends a little bit on your sector and the kinds of risks and dependencies you have. I think the food and beverage, the fashion sectors have a huge dependency on natural resources, and there is a huge security of supply issue. With pharma, our supply chains are a little bit different. We buy a lot of complex chemicals. And actually, if you got traceability back down to the original point of extraction, you'd be talking about tiny amounts, and you would have probably spent a huge amount of time and effort kind of doing the tracing. So I suggest you really take that materiality lens. What are the biggest things that you're buying that come from nature, the natural resources? And then how far can you get in terms of supplier engagement? But yeah, I think there's still a conversation to be had in terms of how much companies invest in specific supply chain traceability versus maybe taking slightly more pragmatic approaches to supplier engagement. But it's a huge challenge.
It is indeed. And maybe Annette on getting beyond tier one.
Yeah. It is a huge challenge, and I think a lot of companies right now is sitting and dealing with how to go about it, how to get the information. And of course, what we see right now is the conversation which has started beyond tier one. It's actually to say, what is it? How dependent are we? Because some organizations do not yet know what goes into everything. It depends a little bit of the type of organizations, how much into the details you need to be, of the quality that you need to be. Some of you are having patents, so you need to have it structured in a much more detailed way, what goes into your products. Others are just buying. So the most right now I see is really getting into the discussion and conversation with the second tier supplier on how vulnerable they see that you are.
I think maybe just to add that the EU deforestation regulation is, of course, driving a lot of that engagement and traceability down the value chain for those in-scope commodities. So I think it's a useful learning exercise for all of us to understand how it can work.
And ultimately, all those efforts will actually enhance the resilience of your business model and of your supply chain. So all the efforts that you're taking are also like financially viable, and you will get a lot of great insights probably from engaging with your suppliers and even identify new market opportunities.
And that also invites for a question from the audience that is a topic we haven't covered, and yet it's omnipresent. And of course, that is what would the implications of the omnibus be for reporting? So a question to everyone on the panel is, can you share your thoughts on future reporting on E4 and the omnibus? And I mean, you are there, so it's irreversible for you.
Yeah, we've already done our first CSRD report. We're also committed to be a TNFD early adopter, so we don't expect to see a lot of changes in terms of how we're talking about our impacts and dependencies and actions on nature externally.
So you keep a steady course.
Keep a steady course.
Right. Annette?
Yeah.
What is your take?
Yeah, but still the same. Organizations are dependent and they have an impact. So that doesn't go away just because everything has stopped a little bit for now. So it's really a matter of addressing, are you resilient? What can you do to become resilient? And how much are you impacting? So the big questions are still out there for the companies to answer. So
what you're saying is dependency doesn't go away, even if reporting requirements may be postponed.
That was a lovely way to say it.
Excellent. And maybe just a question for you also, Isabel. So how would you go about reporting on biodiversity if your area of impact is ocean-based? So now we've talked a lot about land and species. We haven't talked too much about ocean.
First of all, I would say don't worry about that, because TNFD and SBTN also have published a lot of guidances on water and ocean-based and marine and ecosystems. So you can use those ones definitely as a starting point. And then all the tools and databases that we have mentioned, like Encore or IBET, they also always have the dimension of water and marine ecosystems integrated into their tools. So, yeah.
So we stay the course.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I think it's about time for us to wrap up, and that is on me to do. So thank you all for sharing your insights. What we have here, and we will leave you with that, is our recommendations on how you can approach a nature positive strategy, which includes reporting. So first of all, really important to say, don't let reporting drive your nature strategy. Your nature strategy needs to be driven by the business needs, as we have heard from Kath. And then be clear on what you're assessing. Are you talking about impacts or dependencies and risks and opportunities? And then really take an informed decision based on the information you have. Apply a risk-based approach. So you start with the most important, and here the LEAP approach that Annette shared is a really helpful framework. And then I think we all agree that measuring nature-related data is difficult, but because it's difficult doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. We would never have gotten to the moon had that been the case. But that said, be clear on your priorities and be iterative. I think you mentioned that, Kat, as well. Come back to it and revisit your data, and it's okay to come up with numbers that are different once you are wiser. And then finally, to recommend you to use the right tools at the right stage of maturity. So we appreciate that now we've shared Novo Nordisk, a shining example. Many of you would say this is really hard for us to get to that stage. But I think what we've seen is a very structured methodological approach that anyone can take. So thank you for sharing those steps. And then all that is left for me to say is there's more coming up. So we have, in a month's time, we have a webinar on sustainability reporting beyond CSRD. What and how? I guess that's a question for many. Then we would also be looking into the new regulation on packaging, where we would be unlocking the opportunities that relate to sustainable packaging. So maybe one for you to listen to. And finally, for this season, how do you make transition plans for climate change mitigation? How do you go about it? What are the tips? Again, we will have a practical case. So with that, thank you all for listening. And you can always come back to the recording whenever you want. So thank you for being with us today.